Over the last 7 years, Litecoin has struggled to find its place in the crypto space. And with a subpar performance in the 2021 bull run, a lot of people wrote it off. However, over these last few months, we've seen a bit of a revival on what's looked like a dead chart for over 3 years. Is this the beginning of something new for Litecoin, or just another fake out that will lead to lower highs and lower lows as time goes on? In this video, we're going to be exploring the potential justifications for both and how long they might take to play out. If you guys like the video, please consider leaving a like or subscribing, as it does really help out the channel. And with that said, let's get straight into it. So looking at the recent price action for Litecoin, we've seen a 100% move over the last 3 months, give or take. We moved up from this $60 low back at the start of September. This was the last time that we visited this price, and it had been a key level for Litecoin because it kept returning to it for over a year. And it was actually very similar to how XRP's chart looked. We had these double bottoms, like a triple bottom, over the space of a year, and Litecoin, along with XRP, blew up. However, where XRP did like a 4x, Litecoin did a 2x. Now, starting with the more bearish comparison for Litecoin, if we take a look back at 2020, 2021, we can see Litecoin from this low to the high made an 800% move. Now, this is still really good, especially if you bought at these prices. Most people didn't, but for those who did and sold at the top, very few did. Both of these things, they made quite a nice amount of money. However, again, looking at Litecoin going back in history, we can see that these gains are actually quite poor compared to what it's done compared to its bull run in 2017, where it did over basically a 10,000% move in that bull run. So to drop down to an 800% move is quite a serious drop off. And we can see it returns to the previous all-time high instead of putting in a new one, which a lot of people would see as a bit of a red flag in crypto, because a lot of altcoins that don't put in new all-time highs in the next cycle oftentimes don't ever put in a new all-time high. Now, actually looking at some dates, actually before that, I'm just going to confirm with you, I am comparing what we are currently going through, what we've gone through over the last year. I am saying it's more or less equivalent to the time between December of 2019 and December of 2020. I think these are pretty much the same, also more or less the same with June 2016 to like May, June of 2017. I think these are similar timeframes because of the moves that we see beforehand, because of the moves that we see during them, because of the types of moves that we see. We can see they're very similar, especially this cycle compared to last cycle. They all do also occur around the halving time, and they all have a peak right before the halving and then a smaller peak after the halving, except for our current cycle. Now, you can argue that this rally that we've just had is that second peak, because you see we have this first peak before the halving, second peak after the halving, usually first peak before, second peak after. Here we've had our first peak before, no problem, came back down to the low like we always do, and now we've had our second peak. A lot of people would argue, no, this isn't a second peak, this is the start of the bull run, we're going up. We're not going to come back down to these lows. However, every time before when we've had this first peak, second peak, we always come back down to the lows that we were at basically before the first rally up. So we can see here, if we zoom back in to 2016, we get this wick down back low to the lows that we were at before the blue, but even the closers bring us to a price well below the first wick up. Again, same story last cycle. Our lows before the first peak were about $40, $41. We can see here, got our first peak up, came back down, got our second peak up, and came back down to $40, give or take. And our closers just slightly above, but still at the lows that we were previously at. If it's going to play out the same way it is before, we're taking this as your first peak, this is the second peak, you can expect Litecoin to come back down below, first of all, the first peak, which is at $100, but even to possibly come down as low as $60, which would be equivalent to a 50% drop from today's price. Now, again, this doesn't have to happen. Nothing has to repeat itself, but the fact that it's done it the last 2 times does hold some weight, especially the similarities between last cycle with how they look so similar, the percentage moves that we saw, the time frames that it happened over. One reason to disavow this though is the time frame from peak to peak. Usually before last cycle, we saw 27 weeks of difference from this top to this top. Here we're looking at 35 weeks. And if we quickly check the first cycle, we can see it was also 29 weeks. So this is quite an outlier compared to the average of 28 weeks. 35 weeks is quite a stretch above the average. So you could argue that we never got the second peak. We just went back down to the low. And then we've now started our bull run move. And this isn't unreasonable to call for either. We can see that in the past, if we measure from this first peak to the start of the bull run, basically where we got our first strong green candle, last cycle it took 36 weeks. Here it took us 31 weeks from this high to get our first strong green candle, 31 weeks. You could change this and make it 28 weeks. I did 31 just because it was basically when we got this prolonged move upwards. Same here, we got it, the prolonged moved upwards after this. And back first cycle, it was 40 weeks when we got this first kind of green week that resulted in a long move upwards. So you can say that we're either early in terms of it actually being the bull run starting, or we're late with it being the second peak. Either way, it doesn't fit either of the previous scenarios. So whichever you're going to compare to, it's not going to match up properly. So what we're seeing here is something completely new. We're seeing Litecoin break the previous pattern of what it at least did last cycle, and definitely what it did this first cycle as well. It's broken the pattern. Now it could potentially fall back into this pattern if we get a retracement for a couple of weeks over the next few weeks, which to be honest with you, I think we'll get, and we drop down to say $90. Another way to check this is actually to see how far you drop from the peak to the low before moving into your bull run. This first cycle we dropped 40%. This second cycle from the peak to the low, we also dropped 40%. If we take a look here, a 40% from the peak to the low would put you at about $90. So $90 could be a price that Litecoin could see in the very near future. You'll see as well that we drop down pretty quickly after we get these peaks. Last cycle must have been 4 or 5 weeks after the high, 6 or 7 maximum, 2 months basically, within the space of 2 months. The first cycle a little bit longer, but again, 4, 8, 10 weeks basically. So it happens within the space of a couple months. 1 quarter is we've already bottomed out after getting the peak. So again, we might not see Litecoin recover until February. I mean, we peaked at the start of December, plus 2 months, you're looking at the beginning of February. That's when we might see Litecoin recover, and it might only be down from this point on until then. That is, of course, assuming that this is the second peak, which is already pretty dubious itself because it doesn't match previous cycles. It's higher than the first peak, first of all, which Litecoin has never seen. We've also gone up for much longer. It's also much longer after the halving than this last cycle, although it does match up more with this cycle. If you want to check how many weeks after the halving the rally started, we got this first one after 38 weeks. Second cycle, 28 weeks, or 23, sorry. This cycle, if you're going to count this, 30 weeks. So again, if you got the averages, it would probably track. But comparing what we're currently going through to each halving in isolation seems pretty fruitless. It does seem pretty drastic compared to what we've seen in the past. In terms of where Litecoin could go, assuming that we do get this drop down of 40%, we come down to $90. If it wants to follow last cycle and put in an 800% move after returning to this low of $90, we're going to shrink this a bit. You can expect a price of a very, very big new all-time high for Litecoin of somewhere at around $800. An $800 Litecoin is where you could potentially move if you see an 800% move like we did last time from bottoming out. Now, realistically, if Litecoin is just going to do what it did last cycle and the cycle before and cap out at the same price that it always has at just below $400, you're looking at, from today's price, you're looking at about a 200% move. There's a 200% move left for Litecoin if you think it's going to peak at the previous all-time high if you don't think it's going to put in a new all-time high, which based on previous data would be the most reasonable thing to assume. And there's another way of looking at Litecoin where if you look at the previous 7 years, we can see that the peaks have stayed the same, but the volatility, the lows that Litecoin drops to, have raised slightly. They've climbed up. So you can look at this as Litecoin's just getting more and more stable as time goes on. It doesn't move up as much. It doesn't move down as much. It's slowly trending to a straight line, even though that would never happen. Or you can see this as a bullish case where Litecoin's technically putting in higher lows over the last 7 years, and that's gearing us up for a really strong bull run. Either way, it's up to you to decide. I just wanted to show you these kind of points and make you think. Looking at the Bitcoin pair next, I've always said this is my favorite chart in crypto because I think it does a beautiful job of illustrating why it's so important to hold Bitcoin for most of the cycle. And I know a lot of channels say this. It's kind of almost an open secret for people who stay in the crypto space for the long term. Majority of the time, you're going to outperform everybody else if you just hold Bitcoin for 85% each cycle. And you just move into a few alts during alt season, get a bit of cash, move it back into BTC. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is, over the last few weeks, we've actually finally broken this trend that Litecoin seems to follow. You can see that for approximately 45 weeks before the halving and 45 weeks after the halving, Litecoin trends down. It just goes down. We saw this with the first halving. This is against Bitcoin, of course. Just goes down. First halving, traded straight down, got rejected off this line multiple times till we eventually broke back above it. That was the 2017 bull run. But we can see even the highs that Litecoin got to, it never returned to them. It just kept going down after that. Second cycle over the halving. Again, Litecoin traded down for about 90 weeks until it finally broke above in the 2021 bull run. And yes, for those of you that have never seen this chart, this is the 2021 bull run for Litecoin. A measly 100% move, more or less. Just over 100% of a move. If you timed it perfectly, 120% of a move. That was the 2021 bull run for Litecoin. And ever since then, it's traded down, lower highs, lower lows, up until this point where we potentially could see some sort of prolonged bullish price action, potentially similar to what we saw here. Now, for this to happen, Litecoin would have to outperform Bitcoin very blatantly. You know, there would have to be multiple X increase in Litecoin's price on its US dollar chart. Now, for me personally, I don't see Bitcoin doing more than a 2X. And like we saw on the Litecoin chart, I don't think I see Litecoin doing more than a 200% move, which is a 3x. That is from current prices. Now, if you believe both of these things, that means on the Bitcoin Litecoin pair, you should expect a 50% move, roughly, give or take, in the up direction for Litecoin, because Litecoin is going to outperform Bitcoin by 1 extra multiple. And if we take a 50% move up from our current price, that puts Litecoin at 1,700 Satoshis. It's not amazing. If you think Litecoin will 2x Bitcoin's performance over the space of maybe, the next 8 months, 7 months, 6 months, whatever you want to say, if you're expecting a 2x, you can see that we just come into this upper limit range for Litecoin. And this is determined by how far it drops cycle to cycle. Now, this is actually, the percentage I've given it here is a medium of what we saw the last 2 cycles. So first cycle, we dropped 50% from high to high. Second cycle to third cycle, we dropped 70% from high to high. This is just an average, so I took 60%. Could very likely drop another 70%, and that would bring us down basically to a 2x move for Litecoin. That would line up pretty nicely. In my opinion, that's what I would expect from Litecoin this bull run. And again, that would be very similar to what we saw here in the 2021 bull run. More or less a 100% move from the low to the high. Now, from the low to the high, it would be much more than a 100% move, because I'm counting from today's price. If you want to count from the low to the high, it would be a 130% move. So pretty similar, pretty reasonable in my opinion. It would track with what we've seen previously. Another reason to compare this to the 2020 move is if you take the price from the high in 2019, the Bitcoin price high, and when we put in the next high, which was the 2021 bull run, it took us 111 weeks During that time, Litecoin traded down for most of it. You know, we can see for at least 91 weeks here, Litecoin traded down. Here from our previous high, it's been it's been 106 weeks since we peaked here, which is a very similar time frame. When you're basically measuring 2 years, a 5-week difference is not that much. And that's from the high to the high. Again, very similar looking chart, especially if we also get the same 70% drop down to the low. We could also see the same 60% drop from the low to the next low. That's yet to be determined because obviously we haven't played out this cycle yet. But I think, in my opinion, again, opinion alert, this is an opinion. I think this is probably what will happen. And so what does that mean for Litecoin's price? We can see that when it does get these rallies, it usually only lasts for 2 months. If it's a good one, sometimes you get these prolonged periods of time to the upside where you get a strong move up, you hang around for 3 or 4 months, and then another strong move up. I don't think, well, we could see something like that happen. But if we're assuming we're here, which seasonally it tracks, this was basically March of 2021, we're currently in December of 2024, about a 3-month difference there for the 4-year cycle. If we're going to track 2021, you could argue this is the first move up here. We get a little bit of a pullback. We've had a small little bit of a pullback. And then we get a second move up before we ultimately top out. And if we measure these moves, the first move, we got a 64% from the low to the high. If we measure from the low to the high, here we got an 80% move, pretty similar. If we measure from after the correction low to the high again, we get a 70% move here. Potentially, if we're taking this as our low and we move 70% up, it puts us close enough to kind of where we were saying before, this 1800 sats mark. Oh, sorry, that was the first. If it was going to track 2021 exactly, we were going to get 1700 sats. It falls shy of the 22,000 sats that could potentially happen, but I don't think, to be honest with you, it's going to vary. In my opinion, 1700 to 22 sats is where Litecoin peaks out against its Bitcoin pair. That is the range where most predictions based on 2021, this is 2021, based on 2021, that's where most predictions put you. That's the ballpark, 1700 to 2200 sats. Once you get that peak, or at least once we got that peak in 2021, you guessed it, basically down, we actually moved down roughly 76% in the space of a year. So over the year, we basically saw Litecoin's price fall off a cliff. Again, that's against Bitcoin. So whatever Bitcoin fell, Litecoin fell an additional 76% of that before getting some kind of mid-cycle rally and then continuing to fall again. Either way, to me, I remain pessimistic for Litecoin and its future. I don't think we're going to see it break this trend. And if we do, it's going to be a wick to the upside where it quickly corrects down back into this range. I expect to come back to this chart in a year and still be within this kind of 500 sat range, the 30,000 sat range. And I definitely don't think we'll be at the 30,000 sats in a year's time. I would put money on that. But anyway, that's going to wrap up the video, guys. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike. That's totally fine too. Comment down below what alt you want next. I enjoy hearing your opinions as well, so let me know what you think of the video, whether you agree with me, whether you disagree with me. See you in the next one. Take care and peace.